The German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, along with France, Serbia, Russia, Japan, and Great Britain, have been waging war for the last 5 months. Millions have already been impacted by the war, and the war has just entered the year 1915. And for only raging for 5 months, has already lasted longer than both sides had planned. And on the raging of the war, no sign has come to show it stopping. Losses are heavy on both sides of Europe, and they will continue to rise with neither the Entente or Central Powers backing down from the conflict. In the west, the front is completely frozen, and trench warfare dominates the front, with millions of men dug into thousands of miles of trenches that spread from the British Channel to the Swiss Alps. Inches are worth tens of thousands of lives, with wave after wave of men sacrificed for land that has completely been destroyed by the war itself. But both sides plan to not give an inch to their adversary. In the east, the Russian advance is stalled, and now equipment is beginning to dwindle along with their morale, as men from both sides suffer from the harsh Russian winter. But the Russians are not the only ones to be stalled and humiliated by their enemies. The Ottomans fail in the heat of the Egyptian sun, and their men freeze to death in the Russian Caucasus, as well as Austrians have been repelled out of the Serbian capital and run back to Germany with their tail tucked between their legs. Germany, please, I need help. It turns out that the Serbs actually have an army and that the Russians have mobilized quicker than we suspected. God, do I really have to do everything around this house? Not 1 minute passes where I get to just enjoy the TV. Not a second passes. Not a second. Due to the failures of the Ottoman invasion of the Russian Caucasus, to not get the public in an outpour of hatred towards the generals or the war effort itself, the generals would rather blame the Armenians for their failures and began the Armenian Genocide. The Ottomans would base this genocidal attack on the principles that the Armenians were supporting Ottoman enemies and sabotaging the Ottoman war effort. The Armenians are a long discriminated ethnic and religious group who have been persecuted and kept down by the Ottoman Empire for centuries, even today. The Armenians are forced into the deserts of Syria to die. Those that refused to be forcibly moved into the deserts were shot dead, along with any other Armenians that protested this movement. At war's end, somewhere near 1 million to 1.5 million Armenians are killed. The Entente and the world at large would cry out for the Armenians, but nothing would stop the genocide. Even at the war's end, there was nothing that was done and no one was blamed or action taken. The British and the French want to knock out the Ottomans by taking their capital city of Constantinople, and to lift the Ottoman blockade of the Straits for the Russians to be supplied in Ukraine. The man who pushed for this attack was future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The British believed they only needed 50,000 men for this attack to take the Straits, but the French estimated 150,000 men was more likely. The British ignored the French overconfidence in their planning and the Ottomans' will to defend their capital city of Constantinople. Starting on the 19th of February, the French and the British ships began a bombardment of the landing areas, in an attempt to soften up the landing zone and destroy the Ottoman forts on the coast. However, the assault by sea failed, and many British and French ships were damaged, and few destroyed by naval guns or sea mines. The Entente retreats and replans their attacks on Constantinople. On the 25th of April, French and British troops landed in the first naval invasion of the war, and were immediately held up due to a lack of orders and failing to seize the initiative. The Entente, rather than attacking, chose to dig into defensive positions, allowing the Ottomans to move their forces in and make their own. Now both parties were well dug into the peninsula, and a battle of attrition began. Chlorine gas was developed into a chemical weapon by a German Jewish scientist named Fritz Haber. The same man who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his development of fertilizer had now created chemical warfare at an industrial scale. At the Second Battle of Ypres on the 22nd of April, Germany used poison gas for the first time. Spanning over 4 miles across the front, the Germans would release 6,000 cylinders, which held 168 tons of chlorine gas, downwind towards the Entente trenches. Within 10 minutes, 5,000 French colonial troops had died. However, with this newly found success of the Germans, who successfully dislodged the French from their trenches, they did not take full advantage of the situation, not fully knowing how successful this attack was, till the end of the battle, which had proved that gas would now play a key factor in winning the war, or at least giving you an upper hand. Gas masks began to be developed on each side of the front as both sides began to start a chemicals arms race in an attempt to dislodge each other. At the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes on the 7th of February, The Russian forces were defeated again with a range of 60,000 to 140,000 casualties, and the Germans would take 80,000 Russian POWs. However, in the south of the front, the Russians were winning the war, causing the fall of the Austrian port city of
Przemysl.
On the 22nd of March, 120,000 Austrian POWs were taken by the Russians, who themselves suffered 115,000 casualties throughout the span of 133 days siege. This would just be another humiliation towards the Austrians, who would go running to Germany asking for help. So a German and Austrian offensive begins on the 2nd of May to recapture lost Austrian territories in Ukraine, as well as to drive into Russian Ukraine and Poland. By June 3rd, German forces had retaken the port city of
Przemysl
and continued the drive into Russia, whose equipment was lacking and morale was collapsing, sparking the beginning of a never-ending movement east towards Moscow. Germany began its unrestricted submarine warfare in early February in an attempt to starve out the British from much-needed food imports along with weapons and troop shipments from their colonial empire. The blockade was an attempt to bring the British to the negotiation table or to surrender, and in an attempt to counterbalance the English blockade that began in 1914, with the British attempting to do the same thing to the Germans. The Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland on the 7th of May, 1915. A German U-boat fired upon it without warning, killing 1,198 passengers and crew, with 128 Americans who died in the sinking as well. This enraged the American public and war support against the Germans began to rise. The Germans defended themselves by stating that the ship carried weapons of war, and it most certainly did. The Lusitania was carrying cargo of about 173 tons of rifles, ammunition, and shells. The ship's cargo manifest listed 4.2 million rounds, 1,250 empty shell cases, and 18 boxes of non-explosive fuses. As well as on August 19th, a German U-boat sank the SS Arabic, killing 44. 3 of which were Americans. Fearing American retaliation, Germany now lifts the unrestricted submarine warfare on the 1st of September 1915. It now begins to declare themselves before sinking enemy ships. This lessens their stealth and their ability to destroy so much precious cargo that will end up in British hands. At the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle on the 10th of March, the British attacked the German trenches. The British and Indian forces suffered 20% casualties in their offensive with little to no gain. And at the Second Battle of Ypres on the 9th of May, which began with an Entente attack into a triple-pronged offensive into the heavily fortified German lines, the Entente suffered around 130,000 casualties as the Germans suffered 73,000. With 200,000 men dead on both sides, the Entente only managed to gain a few thousand yards. This would prove how costly offensives would be, and the Entente would slow down their attacks in the west unless needed. By summer of 1915, Germany had full aerial superiority in the west, halting the Entente's ability to take aerial reconnaissance of German trenches. The Germans had developed a synchronized gear with the trigger of the machine gun mounted on the front of the plane that allowed the pilot to shoot through the propellers without hitting the blades, allowing the German pilot to be more accurate and able to fire forward. This mechanism made the Entente's airplanes defenseless, and Germany would own the skies for the next few months of the war. Italy joined World War I on the side of the Entente. Italy had negotiated and was given promises of Austrian-Hungarian land that contained Italian peoples. This was enough to get them in and join the war. On the 23rd of May, Italy declares war on Austria-Hungary, and on the 23rd of June, a whole month later, the Battle of Isonzo begins, and Italy is repelled by the Austrian army. Italy failed to take initiative of surprise in the Austrian Alps and the Northern Balkans, who at the time before the battle were scarcely guarded. Gosh, how could they have seen me coming? Dude, you literally waited an entire month before doing anything. To give an idea of how the front looked, imagine the entire Western Front with all of its trenches, and then elevate them into mountains. The Austrians were okay to just sit in the mountains because of the Italian front was a second front to them. Then add this with ill-equipped and ill-trained Italians. The war in the Italian and Austrian Alps did not go well. The Italians were not only repelled from the Alps of the first and second battles of Isonzo, but were repelled on the third and fourth, on the 18th of October and the 10th of November. The German and Austrian advances caused a full retreat from Russian-controlled Poland, with Germany seizing Warsaw on the 5th of August. Hoping to turn the tide of the war, Tsar Nicholas II dismisses Grand Duke Nicholas, who was his cousin, who was in charge of the Russian army. The idea with the royal family taking over the military is to draw more support for the Russian people and to win victories for Russia. However, with the attachment to the army, this brings Tsar Nicholas closer to the army's failures, and the Russian people begin to blame the Russian family for their failures in the war. Can you guys believe the Tsar is failing? I heard that they have a wizard in the cabinet giving out magical treatments and ailments to their son. I heard he left his German wife in charge of the state. His German what? Guys, I'm still stuck on the wizard. They actually have a wizard? Yeah, and the rumor is he's really the one pulling the strings for the government, and that the wife is just in charge as a figurehead. The autumn offensive was a mass attack by the Entente forces on the Western Front in an attempt to relieve the Russians in the east. It was another three-pronged attack, starting with the Second Battle of Champagne, Third Battle of Ypres, and the Battle of Loos. At the Battle of Loos, which happened to be the largest offensive by the British in the war, along with their first use of poison gas by the British, in an attempt to drive the Germans out of the trenches and give them a taste of their own medicine. Yeah, how do you like that? Please. Drama queen. At first, gains were substantial, but with lack of reinforcements and communication, then with German reinforcements moving in, the attack had screeched to a stop, and the offensive was called off. At some points in the front, the Germans pushed them all the way back to where the offensive began. From September 15th to November 4th, nearly 400,000 casualties on each side had occurred. The French losing 192,000, the British 57,000, and the Germans 147,000. Now a very apparent failure of the Gallipoli campaign had now caused French and British troops to slowly leave the peninsula. On the 15th of December, 80,000 Entente men evacuated the peninsula overnight. Not a man was lost. It was the best and most well-executed plan in the war. However, by the end of Gallipoli, the total casualties from both sides was 130,000 dead and 260,000 wounded. This battle marks the first naval invasion in the war and the complete failure of the British and French coordination and overconfidence. The first of the men retreating in early October had landed in a Greek city of
Thessaloniki
in an attempt to aid the Serbs. But however, before the French and British forces from
Thessaloniki
could reinforce the Serbians, the Serbian capital had been lost on the 9th of October by Austrian and German forces. And then on the 14th of October, Bulgaria declared war on the Serbs and joined the Central Powers to reclaim their lost territories in the Second Balkans War against the Serbs and the Greeks. The Bulgarian and German forces had completely overwhelmed the Serbs, who had already had a stretched front. The Serbian army either runs into the freezing Albanian mountains or escapes by sea if they had not been caught or killed by the Central Powers. The Austrians would follow the Serbian army into the Albanian mountains, and Bulgaria and Germany would now begin to line up on the Greek border, as the Greeks debated on which side of the war they should join, even though they already had Entente forces within their borders. Thanks for making it this far. Make sure you like and subscribe to try to get us to 100 subscribers by New Year's. If you want to watch more videos like this one, click on this video or go to my page and find some more.